When 19-year-old Elizabeth Holmes founded her company Theranos, she promised to revolutionize blood testing with a new technology called Ellison. This was to be the iPod of healthcare. A mere pinprick of blood could be used to run hundreds of tests. It would be quick, painless, and affordable. She formed a partnership with Walgreens, and at its peak, her company was worth $10 billion. She was compared to Steve Jobs. She even dressed a little bit like him, in black pants and turtleneck. But it sounded too good to be true, and it was. John Carreyrou, a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning Wall Street Journal reporter, began investigating Theranos in a series of detailed articles. Undaunted by pressure from the company's CEO and lawyers, he did his work and he took on a giant, raising enough doubts about Theranos' policies, procedures, and promises that by 2015, Holmes and her corporation were being investigated by a host of medical authorities, investors, state attorneys general, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and others. And just last Friday, news broke that federal prosecutors have now filed criminal charges against Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes, and her former number 2 executive, Ramesh Sunny Balwani. Carreyrou's new book, Bad Blood, recounts the riveting story of deception, fraud, and pathological lies which he uncovered in what is now being called the biggest corporate fraud since Enron. It's a privilege to introduce him. Please join me in welcoming John Carreyrou to Politics and Prose.
Good evening. I was doing an event like this one in Silicon Valley 2 weeks ago in Menlo Park at an old bookstore called Kepler's Books, which has been around since I think the late 50s and actually predates the concept even of Silicon Valley. And one of the questions that I got from someone in the audience was, which part of the country is your book selling, the best in? And I had actually, as it happened, I had looked at this feature that Amazon.com has that you can access that morning, and had been surprised to see that Bad Blood was the best-selling nonfiction book in Washington, D.C. And so I told this to this Silicon Valley audience, and I also told them that I was surprised because I expected, either Palo Alto or Menlo Park or San Francisco to show up as the region where it sold the most, but it was Washington. And I guess I've thought about that a little bit, and at first it didn't really make sense, but come to think of it, I think, well, first of all, Washington is a place of big egos and power and intrigue, and I think the Theranos story has all of those ingredients. But also, for those of you who have read the book or who will discover it in coming days and weeks, there was a Washington dimension to this. Elizabeth Holmes at one point was trying to get her device, this blood testing device, the last iteration of which was actually called the Mini Lab. The Edison was the second to last iteration of the technology. She was trying to get the Army to use it in the battlefield in Afghanistan, and she had networked with Jim Mattis, who is now our Secretary of Defense. And another part of the Theranos story is that she really exploited a loophole in the laboratory industry and was able to dodge close scrutiny by both the FDA, which regulates diagnostic equipment that labs buy and use to do their testing, and CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is in addition to running the Medicare program. Not many people know this, but it has a second hat, which is that wears a second hat, which is that it regulates clinical labs. And so there are Washington aspects to this story, and Washington figures who were taken by Elizabeth, former famous Washington figures, such as the former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. When you look at her board at the height of her fame, it was a who's who of ex cabinet members and congressmen and retired military commanders, many of whom had spent obviously parts of their lives in Washington. So when I thought about it, it started to make sense why this story interested people in this city. I guess I'll tell you a little bit about how I got onto the Theranos story, and then we can open it up to questions in 10 or 15 minutes. I was. So rewind back to December of 2014, I work at the Wall Street Journal, which has its newsroom in Midtown Manhattan, and I'm a longtime subscriber and reader of the New Yorker magazine, and I often read it on my commute to and from the office. I live in Brooklyn, and so this was an evening in December 2014, and I read this profile of Elizabeth Holmes in the New Yorker on the subway ride home, and she had rocketed to fame about a year earlier, and I actually had not noticed this story put her on my radar for the first time. And there were several things in the story that struck me as odd. Probably the one that was the most odd, or the most off, I should say, was this notion that a college dropout had dropped out, in the middle of her sophomore year with just 2 or 3 semesters of chemical engineering under her belt, and gone on to pioneer groundbreaking medical science. I knew that there was a history of this happening with computers and software and coding, that Mark Zuckerberg, legend has it, learned how to code on his father's computer when he was 10, and Bill Gates, 30 years prior, had done the same thing. And I understood that this sort of thing was possible with software. You could teach yourself how to program with a manual and spending a lot of hours at the keyboard. But I had reported a lot on medicine and healthcare over the previous 10 years, and I knew that this sort of thing didn't really happen in medicine. That in medicine, usually you have to go to medical school and you have to have formal training and then do years and often decades of research. And there's a reason that Nobel scientists in medicine often win the Nobel in their 60s. It's after a lifetime of research and work that they've added value. So that notion that was, it's how she portrayed herself, and the New Yorker writers seemed to believe her, I thought was very odd. But to be fair, I probably would not have done anything with this intuition if I hadn't gotten a tip a few weeks later. I was sitting at my desk in the Journal newsroom, the phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was a fellow by the name of Adam Clapper, who was a pathologist in the Midwest and who moonlighted as the writer of this obscure blog that he called Pathology Blog, and he spelled blog B-L-A-W-G. And I'm confident in saying that not many people read this blog, but I happened to have come across it the previous year and had actually reached out to this guy because I was at the time reporting a series of stories on Medicare fraud, and I needed someone to explain to me the complexities of laboratory billing. And I'd come across this guy's blog and just reached out to him in the hope that he could be the person who would do that, and he did. And I hadn't spoken to him in about 8 months, and here he was calling me again. And it turned out that he had read this New Yorker profile as well, and knowing a thing or two about blood testing, was immediately suspicious of the central claim, which was that she had invented this technology that could run the full range of lab tests off just a tiny drop or two of blood pricked from a finger. And so he had gone ahead and written a short skeptical post on his blog declaring himself a skeptic, and was immediately contacted by a guy who was a Theranos skeptic, a longtime Theranos skeptic, who had been involved in patent litigation with Theranos and had actually, his name was Richard Fuse, and he had actually been the Holmes's neighbor back in the early 80s in Washington, D.C., in Foxhall Crescent. And his wife, Lorraine Fuse, had befriended Elizabeth's mom, Noelle Holmes, and they had become good friends and remained friends for 20 years after that. And the thing about Fuse is that he was a medical inventor and entrepreneur, and he patented quite a few ideas and launched a few companies and sold them and made quite a bit of money. And when Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford in 2003, the Fuses started hearing about her startup through her parents, whom they remained friendly with. And this guy Fuse had been wounded in his pride because he felt that the Holmeses and Elizabeth should have come to him for advice, since medicine and medical inventing was what he did, and they hadn't. And Fuse is very vain and prideful, and at the same time, so he was hurt, but at the same time, he had checked out an interview that Elizabeth had given as a 21-year-old in 2005 to NPR, and also checked out the Theranos website, and he thought there was actually merit to her vision. And he wasn't sure if she would eventually pull it off or not, but it gave him the idea of patenting a mechanism that would alert doctors to an abnormal test result if a device such as the one Elizabeth Holmes was working on were ever to be commercialized. And he figured that down the road, either Theranos or another company would want to license his patent, and that there would be money in it for him. And so he had gone ahead and done that behind the Holmes' back, and later Elizabeth Holmes, around 2008, had learned about his patent, and then a few years after that had sued him in 2011, and had hired the famous lawyer David Boies to sue him, and had pretty much steamrolled him and forced him into an unfavorable settlement, and under which he had to withdraw his patent. And during this litigation, he had become convinced that Theranos was a scam. So when he saw the pathology blogger's post, he immediately contacted him and told him about his suspicions. And it also happened that he had just made contact with a Theranos employee who had just left, who had been the laboratory director at Theranos. And so he relayed this info to the pathology blogger, who relayed it to me. And I realized that, this was information basically 3 times removed from a primary source, but I heard that there was a primary source out there, namely this ex-laboratory director, and that he was alleging, that Theranos wasn't, hadn't really achieved what it claimed, and all manner of wrongdoing. And so I pulled on that string and eventually made contact with the primary source, the lab director. He goes under a pseudonym in the book. The pseudonym is Alan Beam, and I'm still shielding his real name. And when I got Alan Beam on the phone, he was terrified because Theranos lawyers were hounding him and harassing him, and wanted him to sign an affidavit promising, even though he'd already signed a non-disclosure agreement when he'd been hired, they were trying to get him to sign another affidavit pledging to never reveal anything about what he knew about Theranos. And they were also trying to get him to delete emails that he had sent from himself, work emails that he had sent to his personal Gmail account. And so he was just terrified and would not talk to me unless I granted him confidentiality, which I did. And then over the course of an hour, told me a lot of what he knew. And this was February of 2015. And after that first conversation, I just knew this is a huge story. She's been portrayed as this wunderkind, the first female tech billionaire, founder. If what he was saying was correct, she had not only misled investors and essentially committed fraud, but also had gone live with these finger stick tests in Walgreens stores that were faulty, and that were putting patients in harm's way. And in fact, that was the main reason that he was opening up to me, to a reporter. It was in the hope of the eventual story that would be published. He hoped that story would make expose these lies and eventually force Theranos to stop this faulty blood testing. So that's how I got onto the story. And then it became a game of corroboration, because however good my source was, he was an anonymous source, and there was no way the journal was going to allow me to publish this story based on one anonymous source. So I went about trying to find other ex-employees who would talk to me and who would corroborate what this guy was telling me. And that took several months, and I eventually made contact with another former employee by the name of Tyler Schultz, who is the grandson of the former Secretary of State, George Schultz, who these days lives near the Stanford campus and has always been passionate about science, and had met Elizabeth Holmes in 2011 and joined her board and become essentially her biggest champion. And Tyler had met Elizabeth through his grandfather and then gone to work for Theranos, and had only lasted 8 months there, because during those 8 months, he had become convinced that the company was a fraud and was behaving unethically. And so Tyler became a confidential source as well, helping to corroborate what my original source had told me. And then, as I recount in the last part of the book, that's where things got really interesting, because at first Theranos, when I started confronting them with the questions I had and what I'd uncovered in my reporting, I'd also gone to Phoenix and talked to doctors and patients who'd received questionable results. So I had examples of false blood test results. And at first, Theranos sort of put me off, but then started waging a very fierce counterattack. And it involved David Boies and his associates coming to the Journal and sort of threatening us and staring us down for 5 hours in a pretty surreal scene that's recounted in one of the chapters in the book. And also they went about trying to figure out who my confidential sources were, and figured out that Tyler was one of them. So Tyler was then put through an unbelievable ordeal where Theranos and its lawyers pressured him for months. He ended up going dark on me as they were putting the screws to him, and he was ambushed at one point at his grandfather's house by 2 Boies Schiller attorneys, and just had to deal with really a tremendous amount of pressure. And amazingly, with the help of his parents, who hired lawyers for him, was able to withstand this pressure and not cave, and not recant, and not name my sources as Theranos wanted him to do. And in large part, thanks to him and his courage, I was able to go to press with my story 9 months after I started my investigation in October of 2015. And that's when, the scandal sort of broke open. But it took a long time for the fallout, to transpire, and for it to become clear that my reporting was correct and that the Wall Street Journal had been right. And the culmination of all this fallout was, as you mentioned, on Friday, when the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco brought wire fraud criminal charges against Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani that carry a potential prison sentence of 20 years. And so we will now see if she and Sunny either try to negotiate a plea bargain, or if they take this to trial. And if it goes to trial, it will be another interesting chapter in this crazy saga.
Hi, I came here to actually thank you for your excellent journalism. I've read I think it's 30 articles that you've written about this story going back about 3 years.
I think I've written more than 40.
40. I've read most of them. I've read almost every one of them. I just wanted to thank you for that. My question, I've already read the book, and I don't want to reveal anything too much, so just censor me if you need to. So Rupert Murdoch plays a role in this book. And I think he kind of downplayed it a little bit, but he ended up being one of the biggest investors in Theranos towards the end. So, Mark, I wasn't clear in the book if you ended up interviewing him, and second, what would you think was the reason why he let her, she was coming in to kill the story, and he said, "I'm going to let it ride." So, could you answer both those questions?
So for those of you who haven't read the book, when I started digging into Theranos in February of 2015, she was soliciting an investment from Rupert Murdoch, who controls the journal's parent company and is essentially, in a way, my boss. I didn't know that he was being solicited. He didn't know that I was looking into the company. He ended up making an investment in March of 2015, so a couple weeks into my digging. And he invested $125 million in Theranos, which made him the single largest investor. And I had no idea. And the first rumors I heard that he might be an investor, I heard them a couple days before we published in October of 2015, and wasn't able to confirm them. And then sporadically over the ensuing year, kept hearing rumors that he might be an investor, and finally got confirmation of it a year after my first story was published in October of 2016. And when I learned the information from a very good source, I learned that he had not only been an investor, not only was an investor, but was the biggest one. And my jaw dropped. I couldn't believe it. Now, what I did subsequently learn reporting the book is that she had several meetings with him leading up to the publication of my first story, and tried to get him to kill the story. And the last of those meetings had been 2 weeks before we went to press with my story at the very end of September of 2015. And she had gone to his office on the 8th floor of the News Corp building in Midtown Manhattan, and insistently brought up my story and arguing that it was that what I was going to write in it was false and would do great damage to the company, and hoping that he would volunteer to kill it. And he didn't. He told her that he trusted the journal's editors to do the right thing and to handle the matter fairly. And 2 weeks later, we went to press with the story on the front page. With respect to your question about whether I interviewed him for the book, there are some people that I've spoken to on deep background for the book, and if I, with the people that I did that with, I can't, reveal who they are, and so I'm not going to comment. But what I can tell you is that the information about how he came to meet Elizabeth and how she courted him as an investor, and the complete lack of due diligence on his part, all of that comes from a very, very good source.
Hi. Because a good friend of mine recently had a kidney transplant, I'm aware of how complex surgeries like that require long planning and endless batteries of extensive blood tests that basically deplete someone who's already pretty depleted.
Yep.
So the goal that Theranos had is a laudable one from a therapeutic standpoint, but I'm wondering if it really is attainable, and I'm wondering if the people who chose to believe and invested and went on the board were motivated by stories like my friend's, or whether it was more the usual, let's make money on this.
I think that it was probably a combination of the two. I found no evidence in my 3 years of reporting that any of the board members realized that she was a con artist and that she was lying essentially about what she'd achieved. I think they believed her, and they believed in her vision and were excited by this technology. Now, did greed play a role as well? Probably, because she paid these directors, the likes of George Shultz and Henry Kissinger and Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense under Clinton, with hundreds of thousands of shares. And so at the peak valuation of $10 million, those shares were worth several $1 million for each of those directors. But I think, you make a good point, which is that the vision was laudable, and there are very clear and good uses for a product that could do what she claimed hers could do. For people like the patient that you mentioned, for cancer patients who also have a lot of blood draws to determine how they're reacting to the drugs and whether their drug regimens need to be adjusted for newborns, for elderly people. And also field applications, when there are outbreaks in the third world, you could public health authorities could really use a portable blood testing device that does a lot of tests. And as to the feasibility of it, is it possible? The current state of science is such that it's not right now. No one has figured out how to solve a couple of key problems. As I explain in the book, there are about half dozen major classes of blood tests, and each of these classes of blood tests require completely different laboratory techniques and different laboratory instruments to perform. And when you're done with doing your PSA test and your vitamin D test and thyroid tests, which are all in this one class of blood tests called immunoassays, then you're working from a tiny finger stick sample. You don't have any blood left to do the general chemistry assays that if you want to measure cholesterol in the sample or what have you. And no one has been able to crack that nut yet. The other issue is that blood pricked from the finger is actually less pure from the point of view of getting accurate results than venous blood, because it's polluted with tissue from cells. And when you prick the finger and you milk the blood from the finger, often that causes red blood cells to burst and to release potassium into the blood sample, which then increases artificially the concentration of potassium in the finger stick sample. And so potassium in particular is a test that's completely unreliable from capillary samples. And, there's some people in lab medicine who knew this, who were quietly extremely dubious that she had managed to solve that problem.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi. Thanks very much for all your reporting. I'm about 5 pages into the book. But what surprises me is that it doesn't seem to be a realization that they're going to get caught if the tests are not good. The people get bad results, they get retested. And that if they did have the regulatory scrutiny, and I worked at FDA, that it says, yes, this is good enough. And there's no one to say, yes, this is good enough, as far as I can tell. How did they get around that?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the themes of the book, which is that she wanted to be a successful entrepreneur in the tradition of Steve Jobs and Larry Ellison, and these people who built companies and made fortunes in Silicon Valley, essentially in the computer industry. What has now become smartphones and smartphone apps started out with semiconductors in the 60s, and then personal computers in the 80s, and then the internet boom in the 90s, and now smartphones and apps like Uber. And that's completely different than medicine. And in that traditional Silicon Valley tech industry, there's been an ethos of fake it until you make it, overpromise to investors, to everyone, basically get the funding and then use the funding to try to realize the vision and hope that the reality of your product catches up to your hype. And she really channeled that culture and that ethos, and it was a fatal mistake. She should have modeled herself after, say, the biotech industry. There's a big biotech cluster actually just north of Silicon Valley, or at the northern edge of Silicon Valley in South San Francisco. And instead of idolizing Steve Jobs and modeling herself after Steve Jobs, she would have done better to model herself after the founder of Genentech, or these people in South San Francisco who are doing real medical research and who know that when you're working on a product that is going to affect patient lives, because the product's going to be used to make important medical decisions, that you do have to abide by regulations, and that you have to have within your company checks and balances and compliance officers and so on and so forth. And so she really modeled herself after the wrong industry, and I think it's a lesson to draw from this story, this scandal, because increasingly you're seeing out in the Bay Area a convergence between the traditional Silicon Valley and medical research, and people in Silicon Valley are talking a lot about how much healthcare needs to be disrupted. And I think the Theranos scandal shows that the way of doing business in Silicon Valley can only take you so far in healthcare.
Okay, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I may or may not also work for the FDA.
Currently.
Yeah, right.
Maybe currently.
Right. I have two questions. One, can you talk about the environment that Elizabeth Holmes abandoned at Stanford? Because they have an entire infrastructure for technology transfer. They have several incubators that will bring a concept to market, and no small number of those are in the healthcare world. So that's my first question. Then, secondly, her actions as a dropout may have been a combination of hubris and naivete or whatever, but the people that she snowed on her board, on her advisory board, these people, are power brokers. How difficult would it have been for them to reach out to someone, have them sign a non-disclosure agreement, and look at the level of rigor of the science?
Right.
And what does that say about the general scientific and technological literacy of senior policymakers and their general respect for scientists in the United States? I mean,
yeah.
Okay, I'll shut up now. Thank you.
No, it doesn't speak well to it. Your first question about the infrastructure that Stanford has and the incubator, she didn't take advantage of that at all. She operated completely outside of that. She, did an internship at a lab in Singapore between her freshman and sophomore year, and then wrote this patent when she got back home in Houston, and it was for a sort of an armband that would have these microneedles that would painlessly draw little samples of your blood, and then simultaneously diagnose you with whatever ailed you and cure you by injecting the appropriate drug. It was like it was a science fiction vision, and laid out in this patent, or proposed patent. And somehow she managed to still convince Channing Robertson, this well-respected associate dean and professor at the Stanford School of Engineering, that it was a good idea for her to pursue this vision. And he encouraged her to do it, and even joined her board as an advisor. And then, through the years, several people went to him, and he knew that there were issues with the way Elizabeth was running the company, and in particular the scientist Ian Gibbons, who committed suicide in 2013. In 2010, he was an old friend and ex-colleague of Channing's at a previous company, and went to Channing and told him that Elizabeth was behaving both unethically and really managing the company incompetently. And Channing Robertson proceeded to stab him in the back and go to Elizabeth and tell her everything that Ian Gibbons had said. And so Ian was then fired and then rehired but demoted, and that was the beginning of a long spiral that led to him becoming clinically depressed and committing suicide. So she, but the simple answer to your question is that she didn't go through those channels at all. And then, the people like George Shultz and Henry Kissinger and Bill Frist and Sam Nunn and Jim Mattis, all of these people could have done what you say, or they could have at least tried to do what you say. it raised the idea with Elizabeth of hiring an expert and bringing him in. And what would have probably happened is what happened when Walgreens tried to do a modicum of due diligence in 2010 and hired this outside lab expert named Kevin Hunter, who runs a small lab consultancy firm in Chicago, who had worked for a decade at Quest before setting up under his own shingle. And Walgreens brought Hunter in and made him a part of the Walgreens innovation team. And he tried to kick the tires. He went out to Palo Alto several times, and he started asking tough questions. He started smelling a rat, and started trying to, raise alarm bells with the Walgreens executives. And at that point, Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani, her boyfriend, told Walgreens that they no longer wanted this guy, Kevin Hunter, to participate in the meetings between the two companies and in the video conference calls they had every week. And he was, at that point, marginalized. He was excluded by Walgreens, even though they were paying him to look after their own interests. And the reason is that Walgreens executives were terrified that if they didn't do as Sunny and Elizabeth wanted, that Theranos would end the partnership and turn around and start one with CVS, Walgreens' big rival in Rhode Island. So they had this major fear of missing out. And, there were a lot of people over the course of 12 years before I came along, as detailed in the book, who tried to raise red flags. And somehow she overcame each of these obstacles to continue to, develop her con. And so I suspect that if the board members had tried to do what you suggest, that she probably would have just said no. And if they had insisted too much, she would have made them leave the board.
If I could follow up, Francine from Market Watch. We've talked about these issues a little bit on the due diligence and these red flags. So you've described, people that saw this and were skeptical very early in the process. You just described Walgreens, in their partnership, having
This
someone
is in
who told
2010,
them, right? Having someone who told them. You talked about, Mr. Murdoch, didn't do any due diligence. Talk about the board, who willfully served, but, didn't do, their fiduciary responsibility. I mean, another journalist told me that I was Monday morning quarterbacking by saying, there were 100 red flags that people could have reacted to and stopped this a lot sooner. And they didn't. And he said, no, these were smart con artists, and you're expecting too much from investors, even sophisticated investors. I mean, why is someone like Tim Draper, one of the early investors, still defending her on TV, still saying, in spite of an indictment, that she's still a visionary? I mean,
right.
What do you make of this willful complicity or blindness that is just seems to be so pervasive?
Yeah,
unwillingness to do this work.
In the case of Draper, I didn't know Silicon Valley that well when I first got the Theranos tip, and then have since gone to the Bay Area a bunch of times. And it's become sort of my second home, and I feel like I know the Valley a lot better. And I was blown away during this learning process about how much hubris and arrogance there is out there among not just some of the tech founders, but the VCs. And Draper, quite honestly, is exhibit A of that. His position seems to be that just because she was an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley who had a cool vision, that and that she actually pursued that vision, that excuses everything, and that she's exempt from the laws, the rules and the laws that we all have to abide by as citizens of this country. That it gives her carte blanche to really achieve her end by whatever means available. And in this case, the means became this massive fraud that put patients in harm's way. And I think most of you and most people in our country would completely disagree with him and would say that there is no excuse for essentially committing a white collar crime. as to the gullibility of investors, I mean, there's some people who invested money in Theranos here tonight, and I heard from some of them that Elizabeth would, in terms of disclosures to these investors, would essentially run the company like North Korea and wouldn't give them any disclosure about the financials, the revenues, the profits, anything, and not even glimpses of the technology. The North Korea analogy is not even mine. It's actually an analogy that was used by one of the early investors when he spoke to me for the book. And why people put up with that, I don't know. But what I will say that in the thing to know about Theranos, she raised almost $1 billion over 15 years. Most of that money was raised after the fall of 2013, after she went live with the fingerstick tests in Walgreens stores, and she essentially used the fact that the technology was commercialized to convince investors to pour in more money. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought about that. I think those investors saw the fact that the fingerstick tests were available commercially, and that patients were going to stores and getting blood test results as the validation that this technology was for real. It must be. Otherwise, no one would have. Walgreens in particular wouldn't be offering it to its consumers. And so, I think that's what happened with the last round of investors. But the early investors who put in money in 2005, 2006, never could get any information out of the company. And that's actually highly unusual. VCs in Silicon Valley get updates from startups, on a quarterly basis, and often much more frequently if they choose to. Most startups are not run this way.
Hi. So as someone from Silicon Valley, from Mountain View, actually, the story was a little, it hit close to home. My dad works at a startup. I started wondering if I should be asking questions about his CEO. But I was actually going to ask about Draper, but I think one of the other big things I was wondering was about David Boies and his team, in the way that, they were just going after people so relentlessly to defend complete falsehoods. So I don't know, do you think, how much knowledge was there on that legal team of what was going on? And what is it that allows, if they knew some of the extent of what was going on,
Right.
You write about how some of the lawyers made admissions later on where they would kind of retract what they said,
right,
or say small things. I was like, okay, so you're aware that not everything is there.
Right.
How is that kind of defense of a falsehood possible?
Believe it or not, I don't think David Boies knew the extent of the shenanigans at Theranos when he led this campaign, this sort of scorched earth campaign against me and my sources. And I think the full extent of it only dawned on him months later, as regulators started coming in and inspecting. But he had, when they came to the Journal's offices in June of 2015 for the first sort of 5-hour standoff, he must have known that a lot of the fingerstick tests that Theranos was offering in Walgreens stores weren't being performed on Theranos proprietary devices. Because, that was my central question, is how many tests are you doing with a Theranos machine, and how many tests are you doing with commercial analyzers, namely, made by the German company Siemens, which I knew to be the case thanks to my laboratory director source, Alan Beam. And they kept dodging that question, invoking trade secrets. So I think there was some knowledge. I don't think they had the full picture, and I don't think they got the full picture until much later. I don't think that excuses the behavior of the lawyers. I feel like that law firm, and in particular, one lawyer named Mike Brill, behaved like thugs. I hope that their reputation in legal circles takes a hit, because it's really not the way they behaved is not, I don't think, ethical and not appropriate.
Yeah, thank you for all your great reporting. Lots of people have already asked the questions I wanted to ask about how could this have happened, and in particular, how could this have gotten started, bearing in mind what you said at the beginning. When a 19-year-old writes a computer program, that might be something great or it might be nothing, but a 19-year-old making a medical breakthrough is pretty much unheard of. So you've already answered that, but I did want to make one point, though, about Steve Jobs' names comes up so much, and you even mentioned this fake it till you make it attitude. But Apple Computer didn't start with just an idea in the mind, or even just a design. They had a working computer built by Steve Wozniak, and perhaps without that, Steve Jobs may have never amounted to anything at all.
Right, but Steve Jobs did have a tendency to exaggerate or to announce things before they were completely ready. I mean, even the last product, the last huge product that he unveiled in his lifetime was the iPhone in 2007, and the prototype that he showed at the Macworld show, I think it was I can't remember the exact month, in 2007, but it was still, it wasn't a finished product. And so he didn't wait until they had the fully functioning iPhone, which they did about 6 months later, to announce it. And he had a history of doing that. Larry Ellison, who's another Silicon Valley icon, was famous in the early days of Oracle for exaggerating what the Oracle database software could do, and shipped early versions of that software that was crawling with bugs that Oracle essentially relied on its early users, including government agencies, to help them debug. I mean, that's how bulky and unreliable the early Oracle database software was. And eventually they got it to work. And Oracle is now one of the giants of Silicon Valley and is a well-run company. And Larry Ellison is worth, $60 billion and among the 10 richest people in the world. And so I think that Elizabeth Holmes's gambit was, I'm going to pull Larry Ellison. I'm going to, be fast and loose in the early years and hope that eventually the product catches up with my promises, but it never did. If anything, the gap between what she promised and claimed she'd achieved and the reality got only wider and wider. Does that answer your question? Or?
My point was more that, people could believe Steve Jobs when he was at such a young age because he had something to show them. But somehow people believed in Elizabeth Holmes at the very beginning. I can see later on, of course, she could conceal or build a fabrication of lies. But somehow it was like Robertson in particular must have. Yeah, I think. Do you think he actually?
I think Robertson thought that she was full of energy and stubborn and determined, and that probably someone like that was going to be successful at raising money and would hire people with the appropriate, training and education, and that the team that she built with the money she raised might eventually get her there, and that it might be a ticket to riches for him. I suspect Channing Robertson is one of the people who never agreed to speak to me. I suspect that that's what was going on in his head. But going back to your to the parallel with Jobs and the fact that he did have a machine. She also had, various prototypes. The first iteration of the technology was an attempt at a microfluidic system, a cartridge and reader system. And that was actually the most ambitious technology that Theranos ever worked on. And she would have investors come around and they would do these half bogus demos. Because this early microfluidic system didn't work at all. And in fact, the prologue of the book is a scene where the chief financial officer in late 2006 learns 8 months into his tenure at Theranos that these demos are bogus, and confronts her and gets fired on the spot. She people often ask if this was a Madoff-like fraud, and I respond that it's not, in the sense that Madoff, at some point in the early 80s, stopped investing money and started using new money coming in from new investors to repay old ones. And it was a classic Ponzi scheme, and it was very black and white that from that point on, it was a fraud. Elizabeth Holmes, I think, wanted to be a successful entrepreneur and did work on different iterations of her technology for 15 years. But she overpromised, and she refused to acknowledge the setbacks that she encountered, and papered over those setbacks, and then kept insisting that she had achieved what she hadn't. And then the gap between her promises and claims and the reality got so enormous that it became this massive fraud. That's what happened.
Okay, well, this question has actually been asked by others too, but I just can't get around it somehow. And it kind of gets at what you're talking about there. So I'm just trying to picture those first meetings, how she got the likes of George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, James Mattis, some of the other big names. Granted, they're all older men. I notice they're all rather old.
You notice a pattern?
I do, but even accounting for some issues with their men, I would imagine people like them would have even like handlers or minders who make sure that their good name is not put to any use that might besmirch it. For example, I don't see how money is a big motivation for them. I know it's a private company, but typically, the due diligence role of a board is important, maybe less so for a private company. But I'm just trying to understand because she doesn't seem charming. When you read the book, she seems actually quite uncharming. And she fired a lot of people. So there's a lot of disgruntled people out there. I can't believe they were all fearful of David Boies. So how did she not spewing all this sort of bad blood? I mean, she really created bad vibes, okay? But somehow she charmed all of these people. And are there no consequences for them?
Yeah, no, she's a chameleon. I think she did run the company ruthlessly, and starting in 2009, when her boyfriend Sonny joined, he became the enforcer of the punitive culture at the company. But she also could turn on the charm, and she did again and again with these older men, starting with Channing Robertson when she was a teenager, and then Donald L. Lucas, who was the pretty well-known venture capitalist who groomed Larry Ellison, helped him take Oracle Corporation public in the mid-'80s, and then was chairman of the Theranos board for like 4 or 5 years, and developed Alzheimer's, unfortunately. And at that point, she pivoted to George Shultz. And Schultz became her mark, and she met him through a doctor at Stanford Medical School who's now deceased, and they had a long first conversation, and according to Tyler, George has always been very passionate about science, and he was just taken with what she claimed her technology could do, and they started meeting often. He joined the board, and then he introduced her to all his buddies at the Hoover Institution, the think tank on the Stanford campus, and that's how she got to meet most of those guys, the Henry Kissingers and the Bill Perrys. I agree with you that I don't think it was just greed motivating these older men, especially, George Shultz was 92, I think, when he met Elizabeth Holmes. He's 97 now. Plus, he already has made quite a bit of money. I think that they bought into this myth of the Silicon Valley entrepreneur, this cult of the personality, this notion that these young tech founders walk on water, and that they can do incredible things. And I think these older men with all their years and decades of experience somehow were seduced by this, this notion. And she was a young woman, and she, really wooed them and courted them. I'm not necessarily implying that there was anything sexual, but she flattered them and spent a lot of time with them. And, it was pleasant for them to be flattered by this young woman who, in addition to being attractive, was incredibly smart, and very passionate, about her vision. And so they were taken by all that, the whole package.
Yeah. Thanks so much for the book. It was really great to read.
Thank you.
I had two questions, if it's all right. The first, with regard to the AACC meeting
Right.
in Philadelphia.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could provide some additional color on that you might not have been able to include in the book. Steve Master, when he asked his question, it was an amazing moment that really kind of took the lid off of it, once and for all, I would probably surmise. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that. And then secondly, there's, I think, just maybe one suggestion in the book that Elizabeth's baritone voice is perhaps an affect.
It is an affect.
Okay.
For those of you who haven't read the book, there's an anecdote where an employee joins in early 2011, and at the end of a long day, she concludes a meeting with him in her office, gets up, grabs her jacket to leave, and on her way out expresses excitement that he's joined the company and that he's on board and that says that they're going to do great things, and forgets to turn on the baritone and lapses into a more natural sounding young woman's voice. And it's not just, I don't base it just on that anecdote. Her best friend at Stanford was a source for the book and is actually named, it's her real name, Chelsea Burkett. She's the main character in I believe it's chapter 6 of the book. And Chelsea says that Elizabeth's voice sounded nothing like that when she was at Stanford and when she dropped out of Stanford. A family member was a source for the book, and that person says that the voice was affected as well. And then, the best proof of it is that I have a recording of an interview she gave in May 2005 to NPR's Biotech Nation program. And at that point, she's 20 or 21 years old. She's 18 years into having, founded Theranos, and she sounds nothing like the Elizabeth Holmes of 2014, 2015. Her voice is the pitch of her voice is higher. She speaks fast, almost so fast that she sort of stumbles over her own words. She's like this bubbly, young, hyper enthusiastic woman. And when you contrast that to the very poised, contrived, persona that she fashioned over the ensuing decade, it's quite a contrast. What was your other question?
The first question was on Steve Miller.
Right. So for those of you not familiar with this episode, the American Association for Clinical Chemistry held its annual meeting in August 2016. So about 9 months after my first story came out, and a lot of things had happened. Two regulatory agencies, the FDA and the CMS, had gone and inspected Theranos. The SEC and the U.S. Attorney's Office had launched investigations. Theranos had to void tens of thousands of blood test results. Elizabeth Holmes had been banned by CMS from running or owning a laboratory for 2 years. But Elizabeth Holmes still thought that she had a card to play, which was to show, the mini lab prototype, the mini lab being the third and last iteration of the Theranos device, in front of this big audience of lab scientists at the AACC annual meeting. And she thought that if she could just wow them with a demonstration of her prototype, that she could sway public opinion and sort of like restore the universe to what she wanted it to be. She got up at the lectern and gave this sleek presentation. Were you there?
No, but I watched the video.
Yeah. And, it wasn't, everyone was expecting a rigorous scientific study. I mean, not everyone, because a lot of people had doubts that she would really offer any proof. But to really prove people wrong, she would have needed to come out with a rigorous scientific study showing that her machine could do what she had claimed, and data, basically, pages and pages of data. And instead, she came with this very sleek product demo, essentially, and spoke, very eloquently for an hour. She had rehearsed it many times before that day, and then there was a question and answer session in front of about 2,000 or 3,000 lab scientists, and Steve Master, who is someone I've gotten to know, who helped me a lot with the technicalities of blood testing. He's the laboratory director at Vail Cornell Medical Center in New York City, was on this panel of a couple of lab scientists who asked her questions after after her product demonstration, and he said something along the lines of, "Well, what you just showed us today doesn't come close to what you claimed." And at that point, the audience burst out and sort of clapped and hooted. But overall, my impression was that for the most part, she wasn't pushed. All these lab scientists were really polite and really professional, and she wasn't pushed against the ropes like I thought she might be. And I feel like she got off easy during that. During that, what was essentially a big product demonstration, and that was the closest I ever came to her. I was at one point about 20 yards from her. She was on the stage, and I was when the meeting disbanded. I got about 20 yards away from her and couldn't get any closer because of her security.
So first off, thank you for coming here tonight and doing this. A lot of serious, great questions about the matter at hand. I've been following the saga since 2013, and I just got to ask, as a award-winning journalist, a man of great composure, I'm sure, how did you feel? I just want some insight. What came to mind? How did you feel when you found out about the whole Space Invaders game thing? Because I know you weren't able to include it in the book, but it's so bizarre.
Yeah,
I'm curious.
I laughed. I was. Yeah. So just recently, maybe 2 months ago, I talked to someone. Someone reached out to me after seeing an announcement that my book was being moved up. The publication of my book was being moved up in light of the SEC charges. And it was a former Theranos employee, and she asked me to call her. I called her, and in talking to her, I found out that another Theranos employee in May of 2016 had created this version of the Space Invaders game from, I don't know if any of you were born before 1980, but there was this game called Space Invaders that you played on the Atari console. And it was like these invaders falling from the top of the screen and a machine gun that moved left and right. And you shot at the invaders as they came down and tried to destroy them before they got to the bottom. And he had created a Theranos version of Space Invaders and used my photo from my Twitter profile as the invaders, and the machine gun at the bottom was the mini lab, and the bullets that it was spewing that were destroying my face were the little nanotainer vials, Theranos' little nanotainer vials, and so that day after learning of this, I tweeted that the next employee had just told me about this. And 24 hours later, the Theranos employee who made the game reached out to me by email and copped to having created this game, said this was back in May 2016, so it was about 6 or 7 months after my first story came out. At that point, Elizabeth was still spinning the employees. A lot of employees were not aware of the shenanigans in the lab, and some didn't know what to believe. Others were still, believers in the company and of the mindset that I was a hater. And so he actually called the Space Invaders game Haters Gonna Hate version. I think it was version 2.1. And he had since, when he reached out to me after I tweeted, he had since left the company and become convinced that the company was in fact a fraud. And so he wanted me to know that, and he also wanted me to know he wanted to ask me whether I wanted a copy of the game, and I said I did, absolutely. And a couple days later, I got this hard drive in the mail with a copy of the game on it, and then gave it to our tech people at the Journal, and they set it up on this Mac laptop, and I played it, and we did a little fun video showing me playing the Space Invaders Theranos edition. I mean, to answer your question, so much had happened to vindicate me, and to prove that I had been right all along by then, that I didn't take it too seriously, and I didn't take a lot of umbrage. He said he wanted me to specify if the game came up in any of my talks or interviews that he wasn't asked by Elizabeth Holmes or Sunny Balwani to do it. He did it, it was his own idea, and he did it because he wanted to sort of buck up morale among his colleagues at the Newark, California facility of Theranos.
Anything as bizarre set before or after in your whole career?
As the Theranos Space Invaders?
Yeah.
I mean, it is pretty bizarre, but I learned of it so late in the game that it wasn't as stressful as many of the things that the company tried to do to me and to my sources when I was in the midst of trying to expose what they were doing.
Thank you. This has been really great. You talked about the fallout to Theranos and to the patients. Has there been real fallout to Walgreens? And how close was the military to actually incorporating this technology into what they were doing?
In the end, the military never got that close because, as you'll read in the book, a lower-ranking Army officer named David Shoemaker, a lieutenant colonel at Fort Detrick, who was basically the guy that you had to go through to get any medical experiment involving either a drug or a medical device. You had to go through him and get it approved. And he, after she cultivated Mattis and tried to sort of railroad the thing through Mattis, it still ended up on Shoemaker's desk, and he looked at it. He went and met with her once in Palo Alto and a second time a few weeks later in Washington, D.C. And, he didn't know anything about whether the technology worked or not, but he didn't think her regulatory construct was abided by the rules. And he also knew that an experimental device like this one had to either be approved by the FDA before it could be used on soldiers in the field, or the Theranos had to come up with a study protocol with an IRB, an institutional review board that approved the protocol, and then that whole protocol, IRB approved protocol, had to be reviewed by the FDA as well. And he kept telling Elizabeth that, and she tried to steamroll him, and in the end, she was never able to really get it by him.
Walgreens.
Yeah. I mean, Walgreens really didn't do its due diligence and didn't really have any idea about what was going on in the Theranos lab. It didn't know that most of the tests were done on Siemens machines that were hacked, and that few of the tests were done on Theranos technology, and that Theranos technology didn't work. And why? Because she used the same strategy with them, which was to keep them at arm's length and to use the argument that it was trade secrets and that she couldn't disclose anything. They are being sued alongside Theranos in Arizona. There's this putative class action by patients, and it alleges consumer fraud and medical battery, and I believe Walgreens is a co-defendant. And they may also be a co-defendant in an ongoing securities fraud putative class action in California. And so, the consequences, there have been some consequences for Walgreens. I think that if the criminal case goes to trial, Walgreens executives will probably be among the witnesses called to the stand to testify against Holmes and Balwani.
My question is very related to what you just said. How come the test could have been commercialized by Walgreens if it was not FDA approved?
Right. So Elizabeth Holmes exploited this loophole in the lab business known as laboratory developed tests. So usually labs, for most of the tests that they perform, use off-the-shelf commercial equipment made by the likes of Siemens and Becton Dickinson, and those machines, of course, have to be reviewed and approved by the FDA before they're commercialized. But there is this one category of tests known as a laboratory developed test, which are refer to tests that labs fashion with their own methods, not using off-the-shelf technology. And Elizabeth Holmes argued that her fingerstick tests were laboratory developed tests because they used proprietary Theranos methods. And historically, the FDA has used its enforcement discretion, as it calls it, mainly, which means essentially that it hasn't policed the LDT part of the lab business. And CMS doesn't really have the means. CMS is the other regulator, which is the overseer of labs, doesn't really have the means or the resources to police that part of the business. And she and Sonny drove a huge 18-wheeler through this loophole and exploited it. And I mean, we have a person here from the FDA. I don't know if she disagrees with what I just said, or okay. And your agency under the Obama administration was actually moving toward regulating the laboratory developed tests, a corner of the lab business. And unfortunately, since Trump was elected, the new FDA commissioner has completely reversed course on that. And so, if anything, it looks the day that that part of the lab business is closely regulated looks more distant than ever, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful event.